1 in 3 of us did not come back. On average, we lost over 1/3 of our body weight. Militarily, only a few of our goals were ever achieved. But as a morale boost in dark times for Britain and the Commonwealth, we were the perfect tonic. For we showed that the Japanese were not superhuman, that with ordinary troops, superior tactics, they were going to be beaten. The idea was simple. Troops behind the enemy lines, purely in an offensive capacity, are aimed to confuse, intimidate, torment the enemy lines of communication, relying on mobility and concealment to achieve both surprise and avoid our own destruction. For this, Wavell, General Officer Commanding, set up in June 42 the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. Now, the brigade was made up of mostly inexperienced troops from the Indian Army, plus a British battalion that had been on coastal defences back in England. Hadn't seen jungle, much less served in it. Their average age were already well over 30, mostly married men. However, 3 months, the high standard of training in fieldcraft and sabotage, the boys were ready. I mean, we were supposed to be part of a bigger operation, including the Americans and Chinese, but at the last moment, the whole thing got cancelled. However, Wingate convinced Wavell that this was our opportunity and it was now or never for us. So, it was now. 133-mile route march, and then 5 more days on the train and another long march. At this point, we were allowed to grow beards. I wore what you see. Khaki bush shirt, slacks, short gaiters, cap comforter. What else? Well, I had my backpack and webbing and everything else, 7 days rations. Well, weighed around 66 pounds. Weapons. Well, I had this. The American Thompson's machine gun, or Tommy gun, with 5 spare 20-round magazines of 4.5 ammunition, plus a revolver. Probably number 4 with another 40-odd rounds. I suppose to some of you youngsters that might sound quite a lot. It is not. Certainly if you've already seen in action and your next supply drop may be 5 or 6 days away. Look after your ammunition. Your ammunition will look after you. And of course, the fighting knife of the Gurkha, the kukri. A terrible weapon in the right hands. I once saw a young Gurkha clear 4 trenches single-handedly. The fifth had a machine gun nest, creating havoc with us. Out of ammunition, all this young Gurkha had was his kukri and a smoke grenade. So, like the born hunter he was, he crept up to the trench and rolled in the grenade. And as for the enemy, came coughing, spluttering, blinded out of their trench. 4 heads were neatly snicked away from 4 pairs of shoulders. The kukri. Now, if anyone's heard one single fact about this knife, it is usually this, that once drawn from its scabbard, it cannot be returned until it's tasted blood. Rubbish. The kukri is just a general-purpose field knife used for chopping wood, clearing undergrowth, opening awkward cans of beans. The brigade of 7 columns is divided into 2 groups. I was assigned to 3 column under the command of Major Mike Calvert, a legendary officer from the Royal Engineers, and at the beginning of the war in Southeast Asia, he was at bush warfare school teaching British and Australian guerrillas the subtle art of sabotage. Quite the most fearless man I have ever met. Built like a boxer and a strong swimmer, he had been army champion at both. Now, it's a measure of the man that Calvert, commanding officer, couldn't speak the language of his own troops, the Gurkhas. But he earned their complete devotion by the way he went about his job. Now with Calvert, we never once fell into an enemy ambush. But they They were constantly falling into ours. Now, on one occasion, a squad of Japs came round the corner, moving too quickly, chatting. Rifles not held for action. However, a Gurkha fired too early, and the rest quickly joined in with automatic and rifle fire. Now that front group jerked and twisted under the fusillade. Just behind them, more Japs raised their rifles before being met by a burst of automatic and rifle fire. The sound of gunfire echoed around the jungle. The smell of cordac was strong in the nostrils. And then almost as quickly, silence. Not a sound. Still the smell of cordac lingered in the nostrils. And looking into the slight hollow, 7, 8 bodies. But I was almost sure that one had escaped due to the early shot. Bullet whistled overhead. So quickly, I moved over the path and onto the other side. The foliage was light and I moved round the corner. And there he was. Having fired several rounds into our group, he took out a grenade. He arched upwards. A rifle slipped from his grip. And he fell. I was sure that was the last one, and moving up to him, I saw his body. Bizarrely, his face was grey. Eyes stared accusingly. Well, it suddenly occurred to me this is the first Jap I'd seen that I'd killed. And then those feelings, wife, a family back at home, waiting for a letter from a man who's now face up some sandy jungle path. Turned away quickly. You don't have control over your dreams, do you? Now, on returning back to the group of Gurkhas stood over the body of one of their comrades. It looked almost as if he'd been cut in two. Blood covered his uniform. I knew due to orders we couldn't take him with him. I also knew we couldn't let him continue in his suffering. And I thought about the morphia capsules in my haversack, given to us to put him out of his misery permanently. And I remember hesitating. The capsules felt like hot rocks in my hand. I wanted to throw them into the mud. But then again, a painful, agonized cry from this young Gurkha took hold of his arm, looked up into the eyes of his comrades, just turned away, leaving me to administer it in the middle of this jungle. Yeah. Those were the dark times. By the end of June, some 2,000 of the 3,000 original Chindits in Operation Longcloth returned. Of course, that means nearly 1,000 did not. Just over 400 were killed in action, mainly on the way back in their small groups. 100 of the Burmese were given permission to stay behind, look after their families, act as intelligence. Over 400 were captured. Nearly every single one of them died in those Japanese prison camps. Already in a terrible state when captured. Now is not the time to describe what my friends went through. Inhumanity does not cover it. At the end of the war, a group of American journalists and soldiers turned up at a POW camp, and for their shot for the newspapers, it was decided that the American soldiers would hoist one of our comrades upon their shoulders to triumphantly take him through the gates to freedom. My friend struggled, refused, because for 2.5 years he had worked and slaved in that camp, watching those he had known, loved, die. So his promise was that he was going to walk out of that camp. Three strides. That's all he could manage. One inside the camp, one underneath that blasted gate, and one step in freedom. He weighed just under 6 stone. I knew when he was strapping 14-stone man. I really was one of the lucky ones.